Showforge and Weigl devices are heavily built around time synchronization. The default configuration for a Showforge timeline and standalone ProCommander playback is to use an internal or media synced time clock. For larger shows, Timecode has become a standard for many projects around the world. Showforge and Weigl devices have deep integration for MIDI timecode, SMPTE timecode, FSK, and ArtNet. PTP synchronization is also available on certain X series devices. To set up your Showforge timeline to chase a basic timecode signal, with or without a ProCommander, let's go to Settings. For our example today, we're going to use the network card on the Mac to send MIDI timecode directly into the timeline. This allows any ProCommander or any standalone ArtNet or other device output to work with timecode sync through a MIDI timecode network signal. Here, we've selected our network card, which is IP address 192.168.145.180. We've set a timecode listening port of 5556, and we've selected our incoming timecode format via the network as MIDI timecode. The frame rate is set to 30. The dropout or freewheel frames is set to 24. Freewheel frames are set as a way of timecode dropping out and allowing a free run if the timecode should stop or pause for any reason. This is configurable at a user level, but does not need to be used if your timecode is continuous, particularly over the network. Once we've set up the timecode network configuration to get timecode into Showforge, we're ready to start using our timeline with timecode sync. The first thing you'll notice is an icon up here in the upper left-hand corner which punches us in and out of timecode synchronization. As I toggle this switch or I hit the play button, you'll note that this is freewheeling for the amount that I had set that dropout or freewheel frame value. At 24 frames, this represents roughly 1 second of time. With this enabled and the timeline in play, my timeline is now in pause or standby for timecode. I can bring in MIDI timecode from any number of hardware or software applications, but for the purpose of today's example, we're going to use our companion app here of Timecode Commander. Timecode Commander allows me to type in a value in hours, minutes, seconds, and frames. That's a standard value for both SMPTE and MIDI timecode. It allows me to pick the timecode type. Again, our timecode is MIDI, our frame rate is 30, and our IP address and network interface are essentially creating a loopback on port 5556. Generally, we recommend 2 different machines or an iOS app that can drive the timecode value, but for the purpose of this example, we should be sufficient as stated here. If I hit play, what's going to happen is I'm generating the timecode right here where it says 9 seconds and rolling frames here. As I play and stop that timeline, it's going to roll and stop and play my timeline in Showforge. Now that little extra free run and the sort of stop and start you saw there, that was the freewheel frames. If I want a dead on lock or close to it, I'd want to go back in and change my freewheel from 24, which is roughly 1 second, down to something like 1 or 2 frames. We highly would not recommend a 0 freewheel because of course you want some slop there as your source actually would stop or start its free roll. In general, we would refer to this part of the timecode workflow as rehearsal mode. With this, we can turn off and on the timecode sync and allow our user operator to pick up and drag the timecode marker in the timeline and free play this with or without the timecode signal. This means I can back up to, for example, 1 second, play my timeline locally, and then re-enable timecode sync, call back up my timecode commander, hit play in the timeline, and it's going to jam sync up to that value. So I was set here at 14 seconds and 8 frames. Because my freewheel was set to 24 frames, it's going to actually roll a little bit, kind of get us clocked in there so that when we hit play on our external timecode source, it's going to stay in sync based on that external application and run until that freewheel or 24 frame count is exhausted. Again, with this toggle button here for rehearsal mode, either in or out of timecode, we can turn that off, pick up the playhead, play locally, and then re-engage the timecode and use an external control app. This is very typical in theatrical rehearsals where audio or another system would serve as the timecode generator for Showforge. What you're also noticing is that while you're in this rehearsal mode, the media does sync as it's local to the Mac OS machine. So your audio and video is going to scrub as that timecode signal comes in. When you export this to a ProCommander device for standalone playback, Please do note that most devices are only going to edge trigger the media, whereas all of your assets below, whether they're lighting, animatronic, or motion control, those are going to jam sync and ease in and do all of the appropriate jam sync type functions that you would expect of a SMPTE system. Of course, all of the play, stop, record, all those things would still be functional as you'd be used to in Showforge. So even as the timeline is running, I can go in here and I can punch in to record my lighting recordings and punching it out as all that is running. And of course, I still have play, stop, and record. So far, we've looked at a rehearsal mode that allows the Showforge timeline to jam sync to an external timecode signal. This is great for generating a what you see is what you get editing, recording, and workflow for actually getting your timeline creatively crafted for export. If you're deploying on a ProCommander device, in the shows list, simply checking the follows external timecode, picking your frame rate, and applying any SMPTE offset that you may require allows that timeline to do a similar function of loading, pausing, and waiting for either that freewheel time or the timeline timecode to reach the point where it is actually engaged. Once it's engaged, then it's going to follow and jam sync that forwards and backwards until the end of the timeline is reached, at which point it is unloaded. This has nothing to do with the loading of the timeline. This would still follow the standard Weigl protocols of start shows as normal, start shows as add, start shows as restart. However, what it would do is give you the ability to stay in sync with that external time value. Any show can be linked to an external timecode value simply by checking this checkbox. The show number is still how you would trigger it. So for example, if I wanted to try Eye of Baskin with timecode, I would trigger RST1 that would load that timeline, and that timeline would sit there and wait until it saw the external time sync at the value specified. Again, nothing to do with loading it, that's still done external, but this would allow you to jam sync to either a SMPTE, FSK, MIDI timecode, or ArtNet signal. Depending on your ProCommander, you can either do this through a network sync, again, ArtNet, MIDI timecode through the network, particularly on the X series, that's the recommended approach. Or if your device supports it, you can use Legacy, SMPTE, or FSK over an analog signal. Under the Export tab, in your INI, you can trigger your shows as normal with the RST, RSN, RSA commands. There is a special command for preloading the timeline. If I scroll down here, I'm actually going to make my window a little bit bigger here, and I'm going to do a line for timecode triggers. And that command is TC, and of course the frame, seconds, and hours that would be required to get your timecode signal edge triggered. What this does is this would always be scanning for inbound time data at the timeline, hours, seconds, minutes, frames, that you would want to trigger or create an action on. So one example I can do, and of course I'm just kind of putting in an arbitrary timeline here, or time value here, is set this up to say at timecode 00, restart show 1. This has nothing to do with the synchronization of the timeline, just like the synchronization of the timeline had nothing to do with the triggering, but it does allow you an automatic edge trigger to load that show based on an incoming time value. Most users do a startup value, so just at startup, load show 1, and then have show 1 sync to timecode, or they have an external top-level management system that's loading the show and then waiting for timecode. But if you're on an island and you're standalone and you want to trigger based on a timecode value, you can trigger it in the INI and then have it synchronize over here in your shows tab. Nothing else would be different to export a timecode show, and certainly if you wanted to just revert back to internal time, you can uncheck these boxes and redeploy. So there's two separate components, the timecode in Showforge. That's the timeline rehearsal mode, where the timeline would be syncing in a WYSIWYG fashion to the external timecode. And then, of course, there is a deployment, which takes your shows and synchronizes those with or without an offset to external timecode. And then, of course, triggering those either by the regular Weigl signals or with a timecode edge trigger. Then, if that show is timecode based, it would jam sync forwards or backwards. Once you've got all this set up and exported to your SD card, you can monitor the timecode in the Weigl hardware configurator for either Mac or PC, enabling that timecode, opening that socket, and seeing that data come into the system, regenerating it as necessary, and of course adding additional time offsets. You'll see your show play with either the given offset or no offset, and of course you can even toggle whether or not the show off the card would synchronize to timecode or not. So there's plenty of options here in how you interact with your show once it has been exported, but in a hierarchy fashion. You're programming it to the timeline with the rehearsal mode, and what you see is what you get programming. You're exporting it out to the card. You're edge triggering it by timecode if needed. And then, of course, you're managing that through the Weigl hardware configurator as you would need to. For more information, please visit us at faq.weigl.support. Email us at support@weiglcontrols.com. Or for more information about Showforge, email us at info@motolab.com. Thank you.